Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 8th episode of the ProShip ParcelCast. Today, we're going to be talking about do this, not that, dangerous goods shipping 101 with Labelmaster. Today, I'm joined by Clint Boaz and Kristen Dapore. Clint, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, Justin, Clint Boaz, Senior Sales Engineer for ProShip Software. Just a little background, I've been working in multi-carrier shipping technology for almost 2 decades. And here at ProShip, probably had the most experience working with our potential users and existing users about their needs for dangerous goods and some of the capabilities we have along those lines. So glad to be here and to participate today.
Excellent, thank you. Kristen, could you introduce yourself and Labelmaster?
Sure, thanks, Justin. This is Kristen Dapore. I'm the Director of Business Strategy for Labelmaster Software. I've been with Labelmaster for over 10 years now, helping customers to safely transport their dangerous goods and teach them how to do so best way possible.
Excellent. And most people who listen to this ParcelCast know I'm Justin Cramer, one of the co-founders of ProShip and the head of marketing and sales for ProShip. So let's move right into it. As we look at dangerous goods, because this is a really in-depth and technical topic, if we will. I think the first thing we want to know is, well, what is a dangerous good? And Kristen, let's go ahead and start with you. What is a dangerous good, and what are some of the dangerous goods that people might not think of as dangerous goods that we use every day?
Sure, Justin. So I think the basics of a dangerous good is that it's an item or substance that, if not handled or packed properly, it could pose a risk to the health, safety, property, or environment during transit. So that can encompass so many things. Approximately 20% of shipments out on the road or in the air today are considered a dangerous good item. Some of the more common ones may include aerosols or a big tanker of gas or chemicals. Paint and lithium batteries are a big one for today. There are also some other smaller ones that customers may not think about, such as cosmetics and perfumes, spices like cinnamon. Cinnamon's considered an inhalant when in shipping in bulk, and even large shipments of milk can be classified as a marine pollutant. If they were spilled into a waterway, it would cause a lot of the fish to suffocate.
That's very interesting. I guess I wouldn't think of milk as a dangerous goods, but it all depends upon the quantity. And you mentioned something very interesting there that I want to call back up for our audience, and that is 20% or 1 in 5 shipments that we're seeing shipped today is a dangerous good. I think that's a significantly larger number than our audience would consider. Clint, as you've worked in the industry for a long time here, is there anything else that you've seen in that it kind of shocked you as what could be a dangerous good?
Well, I think one of the things that we see working with a lot of shippers is that they have items in their inventory that are dangerous goods, and you wouldn't have suspected that. Like talking with a lot of the large fashion or clothing retailers that we work with, types of companies and storefronts that you see as you walk through a mall. You start talking to them and they say, hey, yeah, we need some processes in place to handle processing of dangerous goods. And you think, what's dangerous, about clothing and about fashion? And they say, oh, well, we have some fragrances. We have colognes, we have perfumes, things like that. Or working with, sporting goods retailer, you find out that there are certain lithium batteries that they have for things like electronic bicycles that can pose a risk. So this is a pervasive issue and one that pops up more often than you would think, because it seems that most of the businesses that we deal with have some degree of dangerous goods, even if it's a very small percentage of what they ship.
Yeah, you made me just think of something. As we try to make IoT happen, Internet of Things, all of those things are either plugged in, and if not, they have a lithium-ion battery, which makes them fall underneath these regulations that we're talking about today. So moving forward here, since our goal here is to identify what's a dangerous good and what's not, Clint, I'm going to go with the example that you had, that clothing stores, basically retailers, they may be shocked at the amount of dangerous goods they have. So Kristen, if I'm a retailer and I'm expanding my catalog, how do I go about validating whether or not what I'm getting from my manufacturers is a dangerous good or not?
That's a great question, and we often run into customers that ask exactly that. And the very first place to look is on the safety data sheet of the material or the product. That's mandatory to be included with the product from every manufacturer. So wherever you are getting that material from, you can reach out to that manufacturer if it's not automatically included. And then within or on the safety data sheet, within section 14 are the transportation guidelines. And that will provide you with your UNID, your proper shipping name, and some of those things that are required to assist you in classifying and mainly determining the potential hazard that that product can cause when out in the world.
Now, is that something, if I've got questions, does it make sense sometime to get a consultant or something like that to come in and review my material masters and say, hey, you want to look at this?
Yeah, you certainly can. And there are a lot of people out there. Labelmaster has a full team of subject matter experts that can assist in classifying and taking a look at the data, because this is a not so common thing that companies don't necessarily pay very close attention to until it's brought to their attention for the most part.
Yeah, I think it was a real shock to the retailers. What was it, 5 or 10 years ago, when the soda streams became really popular? Something you could just walk into the store and literally walk out with. That those were all dangerous goods. So that's something where having somebody that you can ask, or like you said, as you're doing that receiving, look for the safety data sheets. Look to make sure you know what you're receiving, and whether or not you have to control that while you're delivering to your own stores or while you're delivering to customers. So Clint, let's move over to you here for this next question, which is really about just introducing the complexity of the governing bodies. There are multiple governing bodies involved in dangerous goods depending upon how it's shipped. Can you explain a little bit more about that to us?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are laws and standards and things that must be adhered to in order to be compliant, or else you're facing fines and other penalties. And really, the governing bodies for this, there are in the regulation sets. There are really a couple of influences or a couple of factors, and those would be like geographies as well as modes of transport. So, for example, the IATA, International Air Transportation Association, is a trade group that publishes regulations and standards for transport items via air. And it's an international group. So regardless of what geography you are in, your shipments are going to be governed by air, at least through the IATA regulations, the IATA guidelines. That's an international standard. Then you have local country by country standards or region by region standards. In the United States, you've got Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 49 CFR, and that covers local transit within the United States, particularly around ground, but there are regulations in there for ground and air transport as well. That's enforced and regulated by bodies like the Department of Transportation, Homeland Security, et cetera. And then in Canada, you've got TTG as a local regulation. In Europe, you've got ADR. And then, of course, there are other maritime regulations and bodies. So, if you're shipping something that is a dangerous good, that's one of the things that you have to ask yourself is what regulatory body or what regulation set applies based on my geography and also based on whether I'm shipping this, ground or surface transit versus air versus ocean. Those are all things that should be considered as you're looking to transit dangerous goods.
Kristen, let's follow on with that. And I know at least in the US, there's a lot of questions about what is a fully regulated good versus something that would qualify as limited quantity. And maybe if you're really old school, you remember it called ORMD. Could you talk to us a little bit about how those are separated?
As Clint was mentioning the different governing bodies, even within the regulations, it's typically based upon quantity, is different levels that you can classify the product when shipping. So fully regulated is what typically becomes the largest quantity, and it's the most restrictive. And then you also have limited quantity and accepted quantity. But within the regulations for the United States, so no matter how you're shipping, it is still considered a dangerous good. And that means your team, your employees, your shipper needs to have knowledge into shipping a dangerous good and how to properly do it.
I think we talked the other day as we were preparing for this conversation, and it sounds like a lot of training is involved, but there's also, I think there's another level of governance that we kind of missed here, and that's the carriers. We talked about that, and I think one of the things that was where that's been seen most recently is in the vaping world. There's been some federal regulations that have been changed, which has limited what the United States Post Office will do, and many of the national carriers have chosen to take those regulations a step further and choose not to deliver, whether it's the battery containing devices themselves, the liquids, things of that nature. They've chosen not to deliver those to residentials, and in some case, not even to commercial addresses. So there is that one extra layer. Will the carrier themselves actually carry that type of dangerous good? Moving on, because you mentioned training, and one of the things that we're seeing a ton with omnichannel right now is we are seeing companies try to, if it's in their store, use that as an inventory source. But do I need to have at least one person in my store certified, or can I send them to a training program? How can I, if I absolutely need to, execute a regulated shipment from my stores?
No matter if it's a one-time shipment or something reoccurring, the person signing the shipping papers must be DG certified. And that means there's all kinds of courses out there. There are some multi-week covering all modes, ensuring that you know exactly what's going on, but it doesn't have to be that way. So if it is a one-time shipment, you may want to look into, there are some shorter courses that just get into more of the general awareness around shipping dangerous goods. And even if you don't know if you have dangerous goods or not, it does not hurt to look at some of those 1-hour webinars just to be slightly educated in case you need to bring something on to have a better understanding of what shipping dangerous goods can mean.
Well, and that leads into the final question for this section. How do I start this whole process? Again, let's say I'm bringing up my own web store or something like that. Where is a good place to start, and where can I look to start classifying my goods?
The initial starting point should be understanding a general awareness of what you're doing. And from there, you definitely need to get into the classification, which is obtaining that safety data sheet to determine what it says about the product.
Excellent. And as we're doing that, I'm assuming that we want to structure some of this. We want to ensure that we're not doing work twice when we don't have to, because, well, let's face it, if you've got a different individual on the dock each day that's starting to look for those safety data sheets and bring those in, we don't want the same data being recorded twice. We don't want the data being recorded differently at different times. I think that's where we start to move into the storage of data. And when we look at a shipment itself, there's a lot of extra data associated with a dangerous goods movement, whether it's limited quantity, whether it's a fully regulated ground shipment or an air shipment or beyond. Clint, can you talk about the differences between if I'm just shipping, a garment or an inert pad of paper versus if I start shipping something with a lithium-ion battery in it, something that is a fully regulated chemical? things of that nature. It sounds like there's a lot more data that as a shipper, I would actually need to gather and supply to the shipping software.
Yeah, there really is. We talked about identifying if something is hazardous. Once you've identified that something's hazardous, you have to then classify what you have. And there are all kinds of data points that you're going to need to gather and store and be able to provide as part of the shipping process, because you've got to give that information on paperwork. The carriers and your manifest, your shipping carriers will need to know that data so that they know what you're shipping. And so that's part of the classification process. You have to understand what class the item is. Is it like class 1 explosives, class 2 gases, class 3 flammable combustible liquids, et cetera, et cetera. You have to know what class it is, be able to identify that. And there are other data points that you need to know as well. You need to know the UN ID for that material. It's the unique identifier in the United Nations catalog of dangerous goods. You need to know the packing group, packing instruction. You want to know the quantity of the good and the unit of measure for that quantity. There are several additional data points above and beyond just the regular stuff that you would want to know for shipping something like, the ship to address, weight and dimensions, that type of thing. So you've really got to do your homework here. It needs to be done on the front end, and that data needs to be accessible so that you can properly ship out those goods.
And that leads us to our next question. And Clint, I'll start with you, but Kristen, we'll move over to you to provide an additional light on this answer, which is, well, now that I'm collecting this data, where do I store it?
Yeah, you got to put it somewhere. And, I'd say this is probably one of the least well understood subjects when it comes to hazmat shipping. Seems like all the different companies that I've spoken with, when it comes down to this question, this is where there is a lot of confusion. And in a lot of cases, it can be a deal breaker for properly executing hazardous shipments. Because once you've got all that data that describes your commodity or your commodities, if you have many of them in inventory, you've got to put it somewhere. And that needs to be a place that is centrally accessible by all of your different shipping facilities, all of your different distribution centers, all of your different workstations, however you're set up, need to be able to access that data electronically.
Stop there. You mentioned electronically. I know we've both been in warehouses where you see that helper chart behind the shipping station. What's wrong with the simple chart? I mean, it's simple.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the problem. I don't know how many times we've spoken with different shippers who still are going based on either paper records or they've got a flow chart or an information chart, scotch taped to the wall over the packing station. They're still expecting their shippers to go look up things in regulation sets. They've got multiple disparate spreadsheets with information in it. It's obvious that somewhere somebody did not have the vision that was needed to pull all this information together in a central location so that it can be accessed at time of shipping. And that can hold back a lot of shippers from being able to process things efficiently and with confidence. And so it's something that needs to be tackled on the front end. I know the question comes up about where do I store this information once I have it? Really, you want one source of the truth for this information, a master catalog, an item master, a material master. Maybe that's a set of tables in your enterprise system, your ERP or your WMS. Maybe it's stored in a parts catalog or parts inventory somewhere. Maybe it's in your dangerous goods software and you're leveraging some of the capabilities to keep a parts inventory in there. Wherever it is, it needs to be one single point for storing this information, for going there to update it, and for accessing it when it's time to actually produce the paperwork and the manifest for a dangerous goods shipment.
That's very interesting. Kristen, does Labelmaster software allow for the storage of the various goods that we've got for a particular reseller?
We do allow for the storage of various parts, but we too completely agree that there needs to be one master source for this data. And whether it's within Labelmaster's program, whether it's within your ERP or WMS, and it ties in, all of that data should be kept in one source, primarily to ensure that it's kept up throughout the year. Regulations change, and to your point, we see many shippers that are still doing this by hand and by paper. And if you have a shipper who's used to shipping one product the same way for 10 years, that they no longer verify that product within the regulations do change and update. So you need to be cognizant that you're just double checking things to ensure that there have not been changes and you don't end up with a rejected shipment from updates that may have been made to that product.
It just struck me that if somebody's following a paper flow chart, even if it's laminated, right? They're following this flow chart. There's usually a lot of documents that have to be, there's a lot of data that has to be entered and a lot of documents that have to be created. Just off the cuff here, either of you have any idea how long it would take to actually prepare 49 CFR paperwork if you were doing it by hand?
Well, and I just want to interject, just because the chart is laminated doesn't mean the process is going to go any faster. So.
Yeah, we've anecdotally talked to customers that it will take them up to an hour, sometimes even more, for one dangerous good shipment. If they're not quite certain what the product is, as they're going through, they open this several 100-page book to find the appropriate line in the dangerous goods list that then points them to 3 other places in the book that they have to verify if the packing instructions are accurate, if there's any special provisions. And so it can certainly take 40 minutes to an hour quite easily just for one shipment.
Clint, you're one of our subject matter experts when it comes to dangerous goods here at ProShip. When we fully automate dangerous goods for a ProShip shipper, what would you estimate the total time from box on the scale to being pushed into the trailer to be, versus Kristen's worst case scenario of 45 minutes to an hour?
Yeah, well, I think best case scenario, it is either down to seconds or even sub-second in the best implementations. There may be some additional calls to additional data sources that need to be made from the shipping workstation. There may be additional business rules that are implemented that could add, half a second or a second to the process. But if you really have the information stored properly, it's retrievable, you're able to identify what you're shipping, gather that information, and you have the validation checks and the paperwork involved, then you're really talking about a process that shouldn't take any more than really a couple of seconds in the best case.
Excellent. Actually, that could be quite a improvement in throughput for a company, especially if they were also making sure that they are safer with this automation. The information is only as good as its validation. So, Kristen, this next question is to you. How do we keep our stored commodity data valid? Right? If things are changing all the time, I know the other day we were talking about changing regulations on things like hand sanitizer, right? Well, how do I know when I have to change things up? How can I keep that data valid for my shippers?
Unfortunately, the regulations all get published at varying times. So as a customer who's trying to ship dangerous goods, it can be really hard to keep up. IATA, the International Air Regulations, typically publish once a year at the beginning of the year. Maritime will publish every other year. They're every 2 years, but then they'll put out a core addendum in the middle there sometime to make updates. And then with some of the ground entities, so 49 CFR and the DOT, they kind of publish whenever they want. And they're allowed to. So any of these governing bodies are allowed to put out changes at any point throughout the year. And just having to keep up with those can be very strenuous. People often have a full team that's trying to look at or upkeep. I know we have people that monitor it daily to see what changes might be coming. Sometimes you're given a notice, but not always. The lithium battery world's a really good example right now because manufacturers are trying to make these batteries as small as possible, but as powerful as possible as well. And it's just making them extremely unstable. And the regulations for shipping them is changing every day as more and more cell phones get put out or recalls happen for varying items that contain those batteries.
So it sounds like if I were to try to do this manually, I would need somebody whose full-time job was to go through those regulations and check all of those for me. And I think that's why one of the things that we at ProShip want to do is partner with companies like Labelmaster such that in every single shipment, we can validate that it's being packed properly, that the appropriate information is being handled. And again, just like we were talking, moving from that, it is faster, by the way, when everything's laminated. Everything's faster when it's laminated, right? To go moving from that laminated process to an automated electronic process. But it sounds like this also keeps us safe. So if a regulation changed from 1 week to another, we can no longer ship, 10 of those phones in the same box. We have to break that down. By having an integration at the time of shipment, we're never going to let a violating shipment leave the warehouse. So with that, I think the other thing that I want to look at, I want to kind of go back to where we're storing all this data. Again, whether it's in a product like Labelmaster, whether it's in your ERP or WMS or something like that, in a material master. One of the things that a lot of retailers are concerned about is, and let's use makeup as an example, because I might have one, let's say nail polish, right, which is a liquid and has solvents and all these other things in it, but I've got 35 colors of just one named nail polish. I guess part of the question is, do I have to have a person write down every single one of those in my material master? And that question, Kristen, let's have you work on that question first.
Yeah, the setup of the master data within your program is so critical to how quickly and how efficiently you can continue to monitor what you have in your warehouse and how it's getting shipped. To your point, Justin, you have the same exact product, it's just in 35 different colors. As long as that product is sharing the same safety data sheet in the same classification, you want to have a means to tie it together with the other product. We call that like a parent-child relationship, but it basically allows you to say, okay, the regulations changed or this classification changed on this one product, and I know that product is linked to these other 35 different colors, so I only need to make one change and it will affect the others to ensure that we're touching base.
Excellent. That should keep the process of data gathering significantly simpler, even when you have tens of thousands of SKUs. Excellent. And of course, as we look at all of this, we want to actually move to the last major topic area, which is validation. We know what we're looking for now. We have our data stored. Now let's look at how do we safely execute, starting with validation. Clint, what is dangerous goods validation? If I'm never done this process before, is there anything that as a person well versed in logistics that I could equate this to?
Yeah, sure. And I just want to underscore, what you said. Everything that we've been talking about up to this point is described upstream activities, planning type activities. And now we're talking about what happens when it's actually time to prepare a dangerous goods shipment and get it out the door. And validation is an area that a lot of shippers don't know about. They don't know it's something that they could or that they should be doing. But with validation, what we're talking about is, now I've got a shipment to process, and I want to validate that the way I have prepared it is in compliance with the appropriate regulations. I want to make sure I've got acceptable quantities, that the mode that I'm shipping this good via, whether that's air or ground, is appropriate, that I haven't put two incompatible commodities together in this shipment. There are certain things you can't combine because of the combined risk that those present together. You want to make sure you've got all of the correct data prepared. And validation really has to do with checking the regulations to make sure that the way that you've prepared the shipment is correct and is in compliance. And generally what that involves from an automated perspective is pinging dangerous goods validation service, such as the one that Labelmaster provides and that we've built into our ProShip suite via the Labelmaster dangerous goods system. And like you asked about what would we compare it to, I like to compare it to the concept of an address validation, which most anybody who's doing shipping understands what an address validation is and why you do it. But with an address validation, you've got a candidate address you're going to ship something to, and you recognize that there's a risk that that address is incorrect. And if you label that shipment with that address, there's a good chance it's undeliverable, or the carrier is going to have problems delivering it, and you're going to get hit with a steep address correction fee. And that's going to cost you because it's more trouble for the carrier to deliver that. So what you do is you ping an address validation service, you check that against an address database to make sure that it's a valid address. If there's a problem, then it's corrected. So if you've put avenue and it needs to be street, then it can change it to street so that there's not a problem delivering there. And you can then process that shipment to that address confidently, knowing it'll get to its destination and not be held up, and you're not going to get any fees for doing that. Similarly to address validation, dangerous goods validation, you've got a shipment you want to process, you want to validate that the way that you're preparing this is correct. You hit a dangerous goods validation service to get that confirmation. And that allows you to process that shipment and get out the door with a lot more confidence that you're not doing something illegal that will result in steep penalties later on if it gets held up.
Excellent. Now we've compared the two of them. Let's contrast the two of them. I think one of the differences that we want to talk about is the fact that if you send a bad address to most address validation services, you get advice as to what that address could be if it's not found to be a correct address. Do we get advice from a dangerous goods validation service?
Yes, so you do. The error messages and the warnings that come back will tell you what's wrong. For example, these two classes of commodities cannot be combined together. So at that point, you're essentially advised separate them into two separate shipments. Or maybe you've put an item on the wrong mode of transit according to regulations. You'll be told that carrier or that commodity is not acceptable for that mode of transit or with that carrier. You will get some warnings and errors back that will guide you in proper preparation of the shipment.
Okay, Kristen, so with that, it sounds like we're going to get guidance. We're not going to get direct instructions. How would a shipper, outside of that guidance, and Clint had a good one, which is just, these two quantities of goods can't be in the same shipment. What is a retailer to expect from their shipper at that point in time? Should the shipper know how to deal with that? Should they just set it aside and then go look up the regulations later? Is there something that as a retailer I can prepare my shipment personnel for this?
I think the best place would be to double check the regulations, see what's going on. Usually within software validation programs, there will be quick links to say, hey, this is what you shipped and this is what you should be shipping. Let's take a look at what's in that package. I think it's important to also bring up here, Justin, is a little bit of the workflow. At what point in your workflow are you getting these errors or rejections? And how does that potentially play into some of the customer service. Is your package already on the dock when you're going through this validation? You've told a customer that it's going to be there next day air, and you find out that this commodity can't be shipped next day air. So there's a potential that you can run into issues with the customer of when you've told them it's going to be delivered versus the reality of when it can be delivered safely without the potential of being fined.
That's a good point. I'm going to interpret that a little bit for some of our audience. So if you have your dangerous goods validation connected to your shipping software, you either want to look into connecting your e-commerce suite or your OMS directly to the shipping software, or directly to the validation. Often with the shipping software, because it's already got a lot of the rules around how packing is going to occur, things of that nature, that might be an easier interface for you. But Kristen, that's a great point, that you can use this all the way forward in the process to properly advise your customer if they are choosing something that's dangerous goods, that it may not fall underneath that normal. Again, if I'm shipping a pair of jeans, I can ship that next day air with no additional problems. But if I'm shipping, a couple of different perfumes, that's a whole different ball of regulations, especially if I'm going to put it on an airplane. Excellent, excellent. So, and that kind of leads into the next question, which is, how does carrier mode impact validation? So basically, ground versus air versus intermodal. Let's talk about some of the especially around things like lithium ion, because that's a huge topic. Again, given everything is becoming smart nowadays, and pretty soon my stapler is going to tell me when it's running low on staples.
I think that it is one of these days, with as long as there's a battery in there. So ground, air, intermodal, these all interplay together, and the carrier and the mode do make an impact on the ways that you can ship. And so it's very important just to be knowledgeable of how these regulations can change and some of the dependencies they have on each other. I know Clint mentioned it earlier, but just because you can ship something ground under 49 CFR doesn't necessarily mean that FedEx or UPS is willing to accept it. And so you need to make sure that you're verifying the shipment against the regulations as well as the carriers before it goes into commerce.
Yeah, and that point about mode of transit that you brought up earlier about, if you've promised to the customer, I'm going to get this to them tomorrow, what does that mean? In some cases, it may just mean I need to ship this through an air service. It's allowable, but only if I provide some additional paperwork, shipper's declaration or something. Can my software and my system react to that requirement at the drop of a hat? So it doesn't impact the commitment I made to the customer. Or if it's a commodity that can't go via an air service, am I nimble enough, and do I know in my system what carriers will accept that commodity through a ground service, and which of them can get there within the committed time frame, within that next day, 1 day transit? So those are all things that should be considered when engineering, designing the process, in selecting the systems to process these items, because you really want to be nimble and not leave the customer with either unrealistic expectations or expectations that just haven't been fulfilled because you can't execute in the warehouse the promise that you made in the cart.
Yeah, and I think if you've listened to our ParcelCast in the past, you know that not achieving customer expectations is a good way to lose customers. All right, so let's move to now what actually is the last chapter here, but probably the shortest chapter, and that is automation. Clint, if I want to automate this as a retailer, what am I really looking for as part of this automation? What would you be trying to understand and help this reseller to do in order to automate everything?
Well, I think the first thing, and really what we've been talking about, kind of the culmination of all this discussion, is you want to have a properly prepared shipment that's in compliance with the regulations, properly labeled, proper paperwork, proper packaging, going through an appropriate mode of transit for that item. That's the vision that you should have when you begin planning and designing a dangerous goods shipping process, because that's the ultimate end goal. But how you get to that goal also matters, because you really want to put the systems, the training, the processes in place to make sure that you get to that end goal as quickly and efficiently as possible. So we're talking speed. You don't want the operators out there, fumbling through paperwork or relying on flow charts taped to the wall and spending minutes or hours in something that should be doable in seconds. You don't want that to be a bottleneck. But at the same time, if you can speed up the process and add some automation, you're also eliminating a lot of the human error aspect of preparing these shipments as well. If you've got appropriate validation in place, you've got automation that can tell you when the appropriate paperwork needs to be printed and then print it, things in your workflow that can guide the users on what labels and things need to be applied to the carton. All of those things allow you to not only process dangerous goods efficiently, but also with confidence. You don't want there to be any doubt. You want there to be a high degree of confidence that what you're doing is correct and that you're not going to be faced with some of these penalties and fines. Everybody is talking about how to reduce transportation expense. They're looking at expanding carrier portfolios and shortening their zones and changing their packaging types and all these different things. Making sure you don't get hit with a $250,000 fine should be part of the factor, part of the consideration. And it may not be a $250,000 fine. Maybe it's a few $100s or a few $1,000s or whatever it is. But nonetheless, you don't want that. You don't want any of that. You don't want your carriers to reject you from ever being able to process dangerous goods. That's ultimately going to hamstring your business. And so doing this in a way that is efficient and that is confidently done, I think, is the ultimate end goal of everything we've talked about.
Yeah, and I can't help but call back up one of the things you mentioned. In 2018, 2019, labor was one of the #1 concerns for warehouse operators, actually getting personnel to be able to execute packaging. And then once you get that labeler in-house, you want to provide the best value for your dollar on that labor. And if you can automate something and have high confidence that it will actually work, that means you can put that labor to use elsewhere where they can provide greater value in the warehouse processes. Same thing in a store as well. You can provide greater value elsewhere within that facility. I do want to pull one last thing out, and you mentioned a $250,000 fine, and I have also seen companies get large fines. Kristen, can you just give us a quick feel for a range? I mean, we're not trying to scare anybody here, but it is some pretty serious money that can collect pretty quickly here. What have you seen for the range of fines that a company might incur for either knowingly or unknowingly violating one of these regulations?
Typically what we see fines starting at, Justin, for just one parcel shipment that is either incorrectly labeled or an issue on the shipping documents, those can easily start at $1,200 to $1,500. And I've certainly seen fines in the hundreds of thousands for large companies who continually ship incorrectly. I think it's also important, as we're talking about some of the benefits of automation, is to keep in mind that this shipment is the shipper's responsibility. It's not on the carrier to ensure that it's compliant. It's not on the recipient. It is on the shipper to ensure that compliance. And so you need to find a partner that you're comfortable with in staying up to date with all of the changes of the regulations so that you can confidently ship without being worried that you're going to blow up a passenger airplane at some point over the night.
Yeah, yeah. And there have been, I mean, those of you who follow the shipping industry, FedEx has had some fires in planes and things of that nature, and companies have gotten some fines, and something doesn't have to happen. You know, that's the worst case scenario. Something happens because you've improperly labeled or improperly packaged your dangerous goods. A lot of these fines can happen just because you just improperly labeled things, and it was discovered through the various means that the carriers and the DOT have and things of that nature. But Clint, so let's contrast one thing here. If you've got this number off the top of your head, if the minimum fine for violating the dangerous goods is about $1,200, let's go back to that address validation. What's an address correction fee usually?
Oh, it depends on the carrier, but you're probably talking somewhere in like the $10 to $20 range per package.
Quite a different contrast, $10 to $20 versus $1,200 to several $100,000, right? So automating the use of dangerous goods validation software is really a good insurance policy. Just like using address validation is a good way to keep your logistics costs down as well. All right, and so with that, let's open the floor to final advice. Kristen, let's start with you as the primary guest here. Anything you want our audience to know about whether it's Labelmaster itself, dangerous goods shipping, or anything within the logistics world?
Just to be knowledgeable, understand your product, know what you're shipping, and if you need help for anything dangerous goods, Labelmaster is here and happy to help, but please be knowledgeable about what you're putting out into transport.
Excellent. Clint, anything else you want to add as well?
Yeah, I mean, everything we've talked about on this podcast to this point, the points to look at and the advice we've given, do this, not that.
Excellent.
So that's it in summary.
Perfect. Well, I'd like to thank my guests today, Kristen Dapore from Labelmaster and Clint Boaz from ProShip. Again, I'm Justin Cramer, co-founder of ProShip and head of sales. If you have any questions, just a reminder, you can reach ProShip at sales@proshipping.com or 800-353-7774. We hope you join us in May for a ParcelCast with Canadian courier Purelator and about shipping to and from Canada. Thank you, everybody.